was released into Louisiana's atmosphere.
The emissions here are so high and the cancer rates are so high.
Environmentalist David Dreesen has concerns that a new EPA rule, which would place federal limits on toxic emissions, doesn't go far enough.
What's at issue is whether you're going to have really strong, enforceable regulations that'll really get the kind of reductions that EPA is claiming.
The EPA claims the new rule will reduce emissions from chemical plants by as much as 500,000 tons annually. But environmentalists say it's full of loopholes.
A weak rule is worse than no rule because it gives the illusion that the improvements are being made when in fact they're not.
But a spokesman for the chemical industry says that's not true. In fact, when combined with the Louisiana Clean Air Act, Dan Bournet says industry will be tightly regulated.
Let's look at the Louisiana law as it's currently being implemented and what's coming down the pike from the federal law, and understand that when you combine those two, Louisiana will be ahead of every other state in the union.
I'm Marvin McGraw of Channel 2 Eyewitness News.
And you can voice your opinion on the new EPA rule at a public hearing tomorrow night at the Department of Natural Resources building on 4th Street. It begins at 6 o'clock.
Take the 90-day waiver waiting period to determine if they have the power to redistrict the city themselves.
Well, Louisiana is about to be thrust into the center of a national environmental battle, which many see as a test of the Clinton administration. Tomorrow night, federal officials will hold a public hearing here on a controversial new air pollution policy. Environmental reporter Marcin Goldsby has the story.
Joan Forbes lives in this house on Amarillo Street in North Baton Rouge. She says she's trying to sell it and move to a neighborhood with better air.
My daughter has developed respiratory problems, my oldest daughter. She can no longer live here. She lives in Texas. Every time she comes home, she gets ill.
The federal government is proposing to limit the air pollutants coming from industry. The proposal is in the form of a rule drafted by the Environmental Protection Agency under former President Bush. But environmentalists say the proposal doesn't go far enough.
But the rule has too many exemptions and loopholes to be truly effective.
The proposal considers the emissions from each chemical plant as if they came from one spot, so only the total number of emissions from each plant are considered. Most plants, though, emit from several different spots on the plant site. Environmentalists want the government to limit and keep track of emissions from each of those sites.
But overall, we think the EPA has done a very commendable job in putting out a massive regulation, which is really the first step in the implementation of the Federal Clean Air Act.
This controversy puts Louisiana squarely in the middle of the battle, one of the first tests of the Clinton administration's environmental policies. Marcin Goldsby, WAFB News.
Baton Rouge is in the spotlight tonight. Environmentalists and industry officials from all over the nation are squaring off in our city tonight over a proposed EPA rule that would limit toxic emissions from chemical plants.
Marvin McGraw is standing by live at the Department of Natural Resources building where a special public hearing on this issue is just starting. And Marvin, I understand both sides feel there's a lot at stake here.
That's right, Annie, and both sides are also hoping that their testimony here tonight will make the EPA modify or change its rule in some way. Not surprisingly, environmentalists don't think the proposed rule goes far enough, while industry officials believe it's too restrictive. The regulations are the first in a series required by the Federal Clean Air Act. Now, Baton Rouge was chosen as a site for tonight's meeting because many of the industries that will be regulated by this new rule are in this area. Annie?
When will this rule go into effect?
Well, it may not be, it may take some time. Estimates are it could take years before this new rule, when it is finally decided on, will go into effect here in Louisiana and across the nation. We'll have
more
Marvin.
Thanks. We'll look for that update tonight at 10 o'clock on the Night Desk.
From all over the state and nation are in Baton Rouge this evening.
They are here to comment on a proposed EPA rule which would limit toxic air emissions from chemical plants. But according to our environmental reporter Marvin McGraw, some feel the measure does not go far enough.
Industry emits more toxic pollution into Louisiana's atmosphere than in practically any other state. That's why it wasn't surprising when the EPA chose Baton Rouge as a site for a public hearing on a measure which would tighten industrial emissions.
Our communities, the poor white communities, the African-American communities, other people of color communities, those are the communities that are being poisoned
And the EPA heard from concerned residents in a big way. Nearly 200 people turned out, many like Mary Ellender from Lake Charles. Both of Ellender's parents are fighting battles with cancer.
Industry has gotten away with murder, so to say, for the last 40 to 50 years. And it's time that they come to terms with the amounts of emissions that they're allowed.
The EPA claims the new regulations will trim toxic emissions in Louisiana by 87%. But many environmentalists point out industry will still be allowed to emit 280 million pounds of toxic air pollution across the country each year, much of it right here in Louisiana.
There's no real health goal stated in these rules, like reduction in excess cancers, reduction in asthma and heart disease, which are very big burdens for people in this state.
Many people testifying tonight were also concerned with what they call loopholes in the rule, which they claim would allow industry to continue to emit high levels of toxic materials. And you can bet we'll be hearing more about this, Ed.
Okay, Marvin. You know, I didn't hear any industry spokesman tonight in your story. I mean, did they speak? And if so, what do they have to say?
Well, a spokesman for the Louisiana Chemical Association says they're comfortable with the rule as it stands now, but they did not testify at tonight's meeting.
I think you're right. It's not over.
Not over yet.
Thanks. Audrey.
Marvin, thanks.
A proposal by the Environmental Protection Agency to limit toxic air emissions is causing a big controversy today. Last night, environmentalists from all over the state and nation came to Baton Rouge, and they were in town to comment on the proposed EPA rule, which, as Marvin McGraw tells us, some feel doesn't go far enough.
Industry emits more toxic pollution into Louisiana's atmosphere than in practically any other state. That's why it wasn't surprising when the EPA chose Baton Rouge as a site for a public hearing on a measure which would tighten industrial emissions.
Our communities, the poor white communities, the African-American communities, other people of color communities, those are the communities that are being poisoned.
And the EPA heard from concerned residents in a big way. Nearly 200 people turned out, many like Mary Ellender from Lake Charles. Both of Ellender's parents are fighting battles with cancer.
Industry has gotten away with murder, so to say, for the last 40 to 50 years. And it's time that they come to terms with the amounts of emissions that they're allowed.
The EPA claims the new regulations will trim toxic emissions in Louisiana by 87%. But many environmentalists point out industry will still be allowed to emit 280 million pounds of toxic air pollution across the country each year, much of it right here in Louisiana.
There's no real health goal stated in these rules, like reduction in excess cancers, reduction in asthma and heart disease, which are very big burdens for people in this state.
The EPA says, barring any complications, these new air toxic regulations could be on the books by next fall.
I'm Marvin McGraw, Channel 2 Eyewitness News.
Now, many environmentalists also fear the rules contain too many loopholes, which would allow industry to continue to emit high levels of toxic materials.
Now, from your 24-hour news source, this is 6 News.
It's hoops and hoopla as New Orleans merchants are ready to cash in on Final Four fever.
And there appears to be some movement in the cult standoff at Waco, Texas, and allegations of discrimination along Louisiana's alleged Cancer Alley. Good evening. I'm Norman Robbins.
And I'm Chris Fairbairn. Charges that minorities are unfairly affected by pollution and chemicals has set off an investigation by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. This comes after 2 years of digging by the commission. 6 News environmental reporter Jared Bro spent the day in the alleged chemical corridor. And Jared, what do people there think?
Well, Chris, people living in the so-called Cancer Alley first complained to the Civil Rights Commission in 1991. Last year, the commission held hearings in Baton Rouge. Investigators said there was definitely enough reason to look more closely. In the 1950s, the chemical industry moved into Louisiana, converting plantations into industrial sites. 40 years later, the plants are still here, and people are complaining about health effects.
A large majority of these facilities are located next to low-income and minority communities, and that means that they bear the burden.
Mary Lee Orr testified before the Civil Rights Commission in 1992. So did Amos Favorite, who describes himself more as a victim than someone being intentionally poisoned by industry.
I wouldn't think that the chemical company deliberately does that. This is what I think about it. The land was available to sell to them, and we was caught here after the people sold the land to them.
Yet Favorite is concerned that state and federal regulators discredit the value of a poor person's health for the sake of industry when it comes to enforcing environmental regulations. Amos Favorite says the companies take advantage of loopholes in their permits.
He could release more chemical in the air and on the ground and in the waters than he can on his permitted release just by accidental release or untimely release, emergency release.
In 6 weeks, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission is expected to announce whether the poor and minorities are forced to be exposed to higher levels of dangerous chemicals. People in the chemical corridor are anxious to see the results.
I don't want that to be in a pretty bound book put on a shelf somewhere in Washington.
Many people in the industrial corridor say the companies haven't provided them with jobs or a better standard of living. They say the companies have only changed the air that they breathe. Although there is still plenty of farmland available for industry to buy, development in recent years has been stopped, mainly by poor and minority groups, on the grounds that they would be passed over for jobs and be left with pollution. Chris?
Jared, isn't that essentially what happened when Formosa tried to build a rayon plant in Wallace?
That's right. That's exactly what happened up in Wallace, and it's also kept many existing plants from expanding their operations in the chemical corridor.
All right. Thanks, Jared, for the update. Norm?
Now to the environment. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is launching an investigation into whether the EPA discriminates by giving less effort to pollution problems in minority communities. According to environmental reporter Marvin McGraw, the Commission is basing this investigation in part on information gathered right here in South Louisiana.
Like many minority communities in South Louisiana, the village of Alson sits virtually in the middle of an industrial corridor.
With a hazardous waste facility at 2 Superfund sites and then 9 other polluting industries. We feel the effects very sharply. For example,
and Florence Robinson, like many who live in these communities, believe the federal and state agencies who are supposed to protect them aren't doing their job.
Many environmental and civil rights groups have long argued that poor and minority communities house a disproportionate share of this nation's polluting industries and are given low priority when it comes to cleanup.
We're very pleased that the Civil Rights Commission is looking at a problem that we think is very real, that the people...
Mary Lee Orr, whose organization represents more than 70 community-based environmental groups, says the investigation is long overdue.
Our people feel that low-income minority people are disproportionately affected by toxics here in Louisiana.
In fact, statistics show that areas of East Baton Rouge Parish with large minority populations receive the overwhelming share of industrial discharges. Florence Robinson hopes the investigation will bring some changes.
And it's time for this to stop.
I'm Marvin McGraw, Channel 2 Eyewitness News.
You may recall the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was in Baton Rouge last year, gathering information about pollution in this area.